Thankfully for me and for everyone else, I don't have a wardrobe malfunction story for you. We can move past that. I'd like to share the other sentiments and thank Shane Ryan for maintaining the legacy that his father started. I'd like to thank Mark Simon and Mary Simon. I learned this afternoon at the track that you don't want to forget to thank Mary. It causes all sorts of problems. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and I'd like to thank the judges. It's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be here with the other authors, with Andy and Kim. Every now and then, a really good story manages to outlive the interest that it creates. The story just sort of vanishes. It falls off the radar, but it doesn't really die until somebody resurrects it. And that's what happened with Dancer's Image. In 1968, he won the Kentucky Derby. His second choice, he beat Calumet Farms' Forward Pass by a length and a half. And that was big news. It was big news. But it had nothing to compare to the news that was dropped on the racing world 3 days later when Waltham Devilcamp called reporters to Churchill Downs and said that the Derby winner tested positive for a forbidden medication. That was big news everywhere. Front page headlines above the fold in every major paper in the United States and around the world. It was a big deal. But 1968, if you remember 1968, I do. I was a freshman in college, and that was my first Derby. But 1968 was a watershed year in our history. Martin Luther King had been assassinated a few weeks before the Derby. Robert Kennedy was assassinated a few weeks afterward. There were Black Power protests at the Olympics. We were escalating the war in Vietnam. Chicago became a battleground during the Democratic National Convention. And there was just more to write about than an ongoing drug dispute over a Derby winner. And 5 years later, when Lynn Stone, who was president of Churchill Downs at that point, drove from Louisville to Lexington to deliver the Derby trophy to Calumet Farm, Lynn was there, Maggie Glass, who was the secretary, was there, Melvin Cinnamon, the farm manager, was there, a couple of local reporters and a photographer. That was it. No one noticed, no one really seemed to care. And 40 years later, Dancer's Image was just barely an asterisk in the record book. He doesn't even show up on the Derby glasses anymore. And if you write nonfiction, finding these stories is your job. And that was why I wanted to write about Dancer's Image. I wanted to do that for a long time. As I say, it was my first Derby to attend in person. I was in the infield. And in 1968, you could get a lot closer to the rail than you can now. And I saw Dancer's Image move past Forward Pass. I didn't see the finish, but I saw that. And I was stunned, as everyone else was, when I read the headlines a few days later that there was a drug there, or maybe there. That was the point of the whole book. And I lost interest, as people do, but things kept happening to keep my interest. I started working at the Blood Horse. Ed Bowen, who hired me, is out in the crowd now. And I hope he doesn't regret that. But the advantage of working for the Blood Horse then, starting in 1973, was that Kent Hollingsworth was still covering the Dancer's Image controversy. It was still going on. And Kent was a marvelous writer, wonderful journalist, good attorney. And what I learned from him is that you can make a complicated subject understandable without destroying the subject matter. That's what I tried to do in the Dancer's Image book. So it was a privilege to work with him. But again, my interest sort of waned. Then there was the 40-year anniversary, and there was a little bit of publicity about Dancer's Image, piqued my interest again, but it waned. Went to law school and learned that the Dancer's Image court case in the Court of Appeals is the most important administrative law case in Kentucky. So I was interested again. Finally, the stars were aligned. I had been discussing the project with Ned Bonney, who also was in the audience here. Ned was one of Peter Fuller's attorneys. Peter Fuller owned Dancer's Image, and Ned was involved in the litigation from start to finish. And he and I thought this would be a really neat idea, and we finally made it happen. And that was the genesis of Dancer's Image. It remains a fascinating story, and I was stunned that nobody had written about it before. It had showed up as a chapter in a book, an occasional magazine article, an interview with Peter Fuller or two, but nobody had really looked into it. And that's what I wanted to do. I realized that I had a background in racing, I had a background in the law, and I could bring those two things together to actually make the case, 5 years of litigation, accessible to people who didn't want to read 4,000 pages of legal testimony, which I did, finally. I thought it would be very easy to find the record. You know, lawyers keep everything. But it was harder than I thought. I wanted to know what happened in all the hearings. There were a batch of administrative hearings, there were court cases that went to the Court of Appeals, it went back to the administrative hearings, back to the courts. This went on for 5 years. Nobody had a complete record. The attorneys didn't have a complete record. The courts didn't have a complete record. The Kentucky State Archives didn't have a complete record. The court reporter didn't have a record. I was beginning to despair that I would ever find out what actually happened. And I was working at the Keeneland Library, and one of the ladies who was very, very helpful asked what I was doing, and I explained I was researching a book on Dancer's Image. And she said, well, I've got something you really ought to look at. And she wandered off and came back about 15 minutes later with this dusty file box. Looked like it hadn't been opened for 40 years, and probably hadn't. But what was in there was a complete set of all the transcripts of the case. And as far as I know, the Keeneland Library has the only complete set of all the transcripts. The downside of this was I found this complete set when I was about 3 weeks away from my deadline to get the manuscript. So I wound up doing a lot of rewriting. But the deal was, if I got the manuscript to them on time, they guaranteed that the book would be out in time for the Derby last year. And I think the only reason they agreed to do that was because they didn't think I could make the deadline, but I did. And they did. I had the book in hand in early April. And that was clearly a shameless marketing ploy. It would have been a useless book if it came out in June as opposed to coming out in April. So that's the genesis of the book. That's how the book developed. It was a fascinating story. I got to work with some very interesting people. And I'm really excited that the judges have made it a finalist. I'm honored to be in the same group with Andy and Kim, and I appreciate everyone's interest in the book. So thank you very much.